I've been driving trucks for years, long enough to see the weird side of this country, the stuff that no one talks about. But nothing prepared me for that one night. It started like any other. My name's Jack, and I've been hauling freight across the Midwest since I was 22. It's a lonely job, but it pays the bills. I'm used to the solitude of the open road, the hum of the engine, the flicker of my headlights cutting through the dark. It was a cold night in late October, just past midnight. The kind of night where the air feels thick with frost, and the world outside the cab of my truck is just a void. I had a load of industrial equipment headed to Denver, and the clock was ticking. I had about 400 miles left before I could pull into a rest stop and grab some sleep. My eyes were heavy, but the road was long, and there was no time to rest. That's when I noticed it. Off to the side of the road, barely visible under the glow of my headlights, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a tree branch hanging low, or maybe a pile of junk tossed out from a passing car. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't anything natural. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, standing perfectly still, wearing a long, dark coat. His face was hidden, his body unnaturally still. I slowed down instinctively. It was odd, but not enough to completely unsettle me. I'm used to seeing strange things on the road. But then I saw him move, just slightly, but enough to know he wasn't some roadkill or a signpost. He turned his head toward the truck. His eyes, they were wide open, staring straight at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands clenched around the wheel as I accelerated, not looking back, trying to shake off the unease. But something wasn't right. I couldn't get the image of his eyes out of my head. A few miles later, I spotted a rest area. The truck stop was empty, save for a few trucks parked at the far end. I parked, locking the doors as I climbed out of the cab. The air was biting, the silence overwhelming. It was then I heard it, soft, almost inaudible. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. I spun around. There was no one there, just my mind playing tricks. I muttered to myself, rubbing my eyes. But then, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I turned toward the sound, my heart racing. The figure was back. That same man, no creature, was standing by my truck. His eyes locked on me once again, unmoving, his expression eerie. My instincts kicked in. I ran back to the cab, slamming the door shut. I didn't look back. I didn't even try to see if he followed. I just started the engine, peeling out of the rest stop faster than I'd ever driven before. But even as I sped away, I could feel his presence. The eyes, the silence, it was all around me. I don't know how long I drove after that, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Not until the sun started to creep over the horizon, casting a faint glow across the barren road. But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. I thought I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something was waiting, and I knew that sooner or later, it would find me again. The road has a way of testing you, pushing you to the edge. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that this was only the beginning. I didn't stop that night. Couldn't. There was something about that man, no, whatever he was, that I couldn't shake. It was like he had dug his way into my head. A presence that followed me even after the last light from the rest area had disappeared in my rearview mirror. The sun rose, breaking through the endless stretch of highway, and with it, the cold, suffocating weight that had settled on me lifted slightly. But I knew better than to think it was over. It had only just begun. I drove on, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview, never feeling completely at ease. But the miles passed, and the landscape changed from barren stretches of desert to rolling plains and then to the rugged hills near Denver. The further I went, the more the tension in my body started to ease, even if I wasn't sure why. Maybe I had convinced myself it was all in my head, just a bad experience in the middle of nowhere. I needed to forget it. Around 2 p.m., I pulled into a small diner just off the interstate to grab some coffee. I had to stop. My hands were shaking slightly, and I knew my eyes must have been bloodshot from lack of sleep. As I walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and the smell of greasy diner food hit me. The place was practically empty, save for one man sitting in the far corner. He was wearing a trucker hat, just like me, and had a thick beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt a little too familiar. I ignored him at first, heading straight to the counter to order coffee. But as I sat down, I could feel his eyes on me, watching from across the room. "Rough night?" The man's voice was low, gravelly, like it hadn't seen much use recently. I glanced up, confused for a moment, before realizing he was talking to me. I nodded stiffly. "Yeah, you could say that." He didn't smile. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "You saw him, didn't you?" I froze. The air in the diner seemed to grow colder, the clinking of silverware and the hum of the coffee machine fading into the background. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a lump form in my throat. There was no way this guy could know what happened. "Who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The man," he said, his tone almost a whisper now. "The one you saw on the side of the road. He follows us, all of us. Doesn't matter how far you go, he's always there, always watching." I felt a chill spread across my skin. It was like hearing the words out loud made them somehow realer, more terrifying. The man continued without waiting for me to respond. "You're not the first," he said, shaking his head slowly. "He's been around for years, maybe longer. Some say he's a ghost, others say he's something worse. No one knows for sure, but he knows when you're weak, knows when you're alone, and that's when he comes for you." I didn't know what to say. Felt insane to be hearing this. Felt like a bad joke or some tall tale. But the more I looked at this guy, the more I realized he wasn't kidding. He was as serious as death itself. "How do you know?" I asked, barely able to breathe. The man looked at me with eyes that were tired, worn down by years of seeing something most people couldn't. "I've seen him too. A long time ago. Thought I could outrun him. But you can't outrun something that's already inside you." I didn't want to hear any more. My stomach churned, and I suddenly had the overwhelming urge to leave. But before I could get up, the man's voice stopped me. "Don't be foolish. He'll find you again. And next time, he won't let you get away. The only thing you can do is keep moving. Keep driving." I didn't ask any more questions. I paid for my coffee and left, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why I felt so unsettled. Maybe it was the man's words, or maybe it was the way his eyes burned into mine, like he knew something I didn't want to know. I climbed back into my truck and hit the road, the engine roaring to life beneath me. The world outside seemed to blur as I sped down the highway, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind me, watching, waiting. Hours passed. My eyes were starting to play tricks on me. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't, flickers of movement in the corner of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was just the fatigue, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was out there, following me just like the man in the diner said. I didn't stop again that night. There was no rest area, no diner, no place to hide. Just the endless stretch of road and the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, just as the darkness swallowed the last of the daylight, I saw it again. The figure, standing on the side of the road, watching, waiting. I slammed on the brakes, but this time, I didn't just see him. He was in front of me. He was in the middle of the road, and he wasn't alone. I froze. My foot was still on the brake, my fingers numb around the steering wheel. The figure in the road, it was no longer just standing there, motionless. This time, he was walking toward me, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. His long coat billowed out behind him, his face still hidden in the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wasn't sure if it was fear or sheer panic, but I couldn't seem to move. I wanted to drive away, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The truck's headlights illuminated the figure more clearly now, and I saw nothing. No face, no details, just blackness where his features should have been. I should have just driven past. I should have gunned the engine and gotten out of there. But as I tried to shift into gear, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a second figure, another person or thing walking just behind the first one. This one was different. It wasn't wearing a coat. It didn't even seem human. It was gaunt, skeletal, its limbs stretched out unnaturally long, and its eyes glowing. Two pools of light in the darkness, burning through the night. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Suddenly, the man in front of me moved again. He reached into his coat and pulled something out. I could hear the sound of metal scraping as he held it in the air. A knife, a long, gleaming blade, catching the light from my headlights. The breath I had been holding escaped in a sharp gasp. I slammed the gearshift into drive and floored the gas pedal, tearing away from the figures as fast as I could. My truck roared to life, the tires screeching against the asphalt. But even as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, watching. But this time I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove for miles, my heart racing, sweat soaking through my shirt. I kept expecting to see them in the rearview mirror, those glowing eyes, the man with the knife. But I didn't see anything, just the endless stretch of dark highway behind me. It wasn't until the adrenaline began to fade that I noticed something, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the truck's engine. But then it came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I glanced over. There was no one outside, no one in sight. I told myself it was just the stress, the exhaustion. But the tapping continued, louder now. And the worst part? It was coming from inside the cab. I jerked my head toward the passenger seat. The window was cracked open just a little, but the tapping, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the seat next to me. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me. Slowly, I turned my head. There was someone sitting there, a man dressed in the same long coat, his face still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even breathing, just sitting there perfectly still. I froze, my body going cold. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. Was this real? Had I finally snapped? Or was this some kind of nightmare I couldn't escape? Then, without warning, the man spoke. "You should have stayed on the road." His voice was low, calm, as if we were having a casual conversation. But there was an undertone, something dark and dangerous in his words. My mouth went dry. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply reached out, slowly, deliberately, until his hand rested on the armrest. His fingers were unnaturally long, the skin pale and stretched thin over bone. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said again, his voice almost soothing now. "You shouldn't have looked back. You've made a mistake." I didn't know what he meant, but something in his words sent a jolt of terror through my veins. "Who are you?" I gasped, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The man didn't answer at first. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating my question. Then, with a faint, twisted smile, he leaned forward. His face came into the light, and I almost vomited from the shock. There was nothing there, just a black void, a hollow, gaping hole where his face should have been. I screamed, but before I could react, the truck swerved violently. The wheel spun out of my control, and I slammed my foot on the brakes, fighting to stay in control. I managed to right the truck, pulling it to the side of the road, my heart racing. I didn't even know if I was still awake, or if this was just some horrific dream I couldn't wake up from. But then I heard it again. The tapping. It was back. Louder, more insistent this time. I didn't need to look to know what it was. I could feel it, him there in the seat next to me, waiting. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, a voice came from behind me, soft but clear. "You're not going anywhere." Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The words, "You're not going anywhere," echoed in my head, drowning out every rational thought I had left. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but there was no one there. No one in the truck. But I could feel it, the presence, pressing against me, suffocating me from every angle. I glanced down at the door handle, knowing that I had to leave, but my hand wouldn't move. My body was paralyzed, like some invisible force was holding me in place, keeping me trapped in this nightmare. The engine hummed beneath me, but it felt like I was stuck in time, as if nothing existed outside this moment. And then, just as quickly as it started, the pressure lifted. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring ahead at the empty road, before I finally found the strength to move. I pushed the door open and stumbled out of the truck, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. My breaths were ragged, and I could feel the cold air slicing through my skin. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong. It wasn't the asphalt of the highway anymore. It was soft, like dirt or mud, and my boots sank into it with each step. The dim light of my truck's headlights illuminated nothing but an endless stretch of blackness. I turned around, expecting to see the figure from before, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the truck's engine. That's when I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the truck. It was coming from behind me. I spun around. There, in the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Another hallucination, another ghost. But as it grew closer, I could see it more clearly. It was the man in the coat. His face still hidden, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked with a purpose, each step bringing him closer to me. I should have run. I should have gotten back into the truck and driven away. But some sick part of me, wanted to know who he was, what he wanted. You're not real, I muttered, though the words tasted empty in my mouth. I didn't believe it, but I said it anyway. Maybe if I denied it, he'd go away. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, if you could even call them that, seemed to burn with an intense light, a glimmer of something ancient, something powerful. His presence was like a force of nature, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I knew that whatever he was, whatever he had become, he wasn't human anymore. He stopped a few feet away, just outside the reach of my headlights. His shadow stretched across the ground, impossibly long, like it belonged to something far larger than any man. I backed up, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The fear was paralyzing. You should have stayed in the truck, he said, his voice cold and unfeeling, like it was carried on the wind itself. You don't understand, do you? This road, it never lets you go. Claims you, all of you. Once you've seen it, once you've felt it, you're part of it. Forever. I swallowed hard, the words sinking in. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. Who are you? I croaked, my throat tight with terror. What do you want? The figure didn't answer immediately. He took a slow step forward, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble, like the very earth was shifting. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer now, but still as chilling as ever. I am the road, he said, and you are mine. All of you who pass through this land, you belong to me. I take something from you every time you stop, every time you try to leave, but you can never escape. Not really, not now. The words didn't make sense, but the way he said them, it felt like some kind of ancient curse, like I had walked into something I couldn't escape. Without warning, the man reached out, his hand extending toward me. I staggered back, tripping over my own feet, but the road seemed to pull me back, drawing me in. My body was no longer my own. It was as if the earth itself was claiming me, pulling me into its depths. But just before his hand could touch me, someone shouted, "Get away from him!" I whipped around, my heart racing. There, in the distance, was another figure. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket and boots, like a fellow trucker. His face was rugged, his eyes sharp and determined. He was running toward me, shouting something I couldn't hear. The man in the coat turned, his head snapping to the side, as if noticing the new arrival for the first time. A hiss, like the sound of a snake, came from his throat, and suddenly, I felt the ground tremble again. The man in the coat didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The new figure reached me, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me away from the man, away from whatever he was. "Come on!" the man shouted, his voice desperate. "We have to go now." But I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my mind battling with the overwhelming terror that gripped me. "Why?" I gasped, my voice trembling. "Who are you?" The man glanced over his shoulder at the figure in the coat, who had stopped moving and was now watching us, standing perfectly still, his glowing eyes burning like coals. "Just go," the man shouted again, dragging me away. As we ran, I could hear the man in the coat behind us, his footsteps echoing with an unnatural rhythm, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something terrible. We made it back to my truck, but just as I climbed inside, the figure stopped. He didn't follow. He just stood there on the side of the road, watching. "You can't escape," he called out, his voice drifting through the wind. "Not now. Not ever." I slammed the truck door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled to turn the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the sound felt hollow. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing louder than the truck's engine, drowning out everything else. I didn't even know who the hell that man was, how he knew about the figure, or why he saved me. I didn't care. All I knew was that we had to get out of there. We had to leave or I wouldn't make it through the night. "Drive," the stranger said, his voice firm, almost urgent. His hands gripped the seat, and his eyes never left the rearview mirror, where the figure in the coat still stood, watching, waiting. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward, and we sped down the dark highway. The lights from the truck reflected in the glass of the side mirrors, but there was nothing in them. No sign of the man in the coat, no glowing eyes. But I knew he was still out there. The silence in the cab was suffocating. Neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, like something was hanging over us, waiting to come crashing down. I couldn't stop shaking, my hands still clenching the steering wheel. I glanced over at the man beside me. He was watching the road ahead, his jaw clenched, his body tense, as if waiting for something. But what? I finally broke the silence. "Who are you?" My voice cracked as the words left my lips, and I immediately regretted asking. But I needed to know. I needed answers. He didn't look at me. "Doesn't matter," he said, his tone cold. "What matters is that you made it this far, and now you need to keep moving. If you stop, even for a second, it's over." I swallowed hard, the words sinking in. Over? What the hell did that mean? I wanted to ask more, to get some explanation, but I didn't have the strength. I just needed to get away. I needed to keep driving. For miles, the only sound in the truck was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind outside the windows. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure, but there was nothing. The highway stretched out in front of us like an endless tunnel. And then I saw it. A flicker. A flash of movement in the distance. I slammed on the brakes. Ahead of us, standing right in the middle of the road, was the man in the coat. But this time he wasn't alone. There were others. Figures, dozens of them, lined the road, standing in the darkness, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing. Some of them were tall, others short, but all of them had the same presence, the same emptiness, the same unnatural stillness. I could feel the air in the truck grow cold. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts. My hands shook violently on the wheel. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The stranger beside me didn't respond. He just reached forward, yanking the truck back into gear. "Drive. Now." Without thinking, I pressed the gas again, the truck roaring to life as I tore down the road, my foot heavy on the pedal. The figures in the distance didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I tried not to look at them, tried to keep my focus on the road, but I couldn't help it. Every time I glanced back, I saw their glowing eyes, their faces, twisted in the shadows, staring at me, at us. As I drove, I heard a sound, a scratching noise, like claws on metal, coming from the outside of the truck. I jerked my head to the side, but I couldn't see anything, just darkness. The noise got louder, more frantic. The truck shuddered under the pressure, as if something was trying to claw its way inside. I screamed, slamming the truck into higher gear, but the scratching didn't stop. It was like they were surrounding us, like they were closing in. And then, through the roar of the engine and the shrill scratching, I heard a voice. It was soft, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it felt like it was right next to me. "You're not safe." I snapped my head to the side, but the stranger was still there, silent, staring out the windshield. He hadn't spoken. He didn't seem affected by the voices. The scratching intensified. The truck jolted again, harder this time, and I nearly lost control of the wheel. The fear was suffocating, overwhelming. I was almost out of my mind. I needed to stop. I needed to pull over, but I couldn't. If I stopped, I just knew that it was over, that something worse would happen. "Why are they doing this?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What do they want from me?" The stranger's face twisted in a grimace. "It's not you they want. It's the road. It's always the road." I didn't understand what he meant, but there was no time to ask. I could hear them, feel them getting closer. Their presence was like a weight pressing down on me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. "Whatever you do," the stranger said, his voice strained. "Don't stop. Don't look back." I didn't answer, couldn't. All I could do was keep driving, my hands locked to the wheel, my mind screaming for relief that never came. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the scratching stopped. The figures disappeared from the road. The silence was deafening. But I knew that this wasn't over, that it wasn't just a bad dream. It was real, and it was coming for me, for both of us. The silence that followed was almost worse than the chaos. Felt wrong. The truck, the road, the air, everything seemed frozen in time. I didn't dare take my foot off the gas. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, waiting for something to move, to change. But the miles passed and nothing happened. The truck felt empty. There was nothing but the low hum of the engine and the soft swish of tires against asphalt. The stranger beside me hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the windshield. His jaw clenched tight as if he were fighting something, some kind of battle within himself. He didn't say a word. I couldn't stand the silence any longer. "What the hell is happening?" I blurted out, my voice raw. "Who are those people? What do they want from me? From this road?" The stranger finally looked at me. His gaze was heavy, like he had seen too much, like he had known this moment would come. But his answer was simple, empty, and terrifying. "They want your soul," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And they'll get it sooner or later." Couldn't breathe. I felt a sickening cold spread through my body, like the life was draining out of me. I gripped the wheel harder, my knuckles white, my head spinning. "Your soul is the price," the stranger continued, his voice calm but with an edge of desperation I hadn't noticed before. "It's always the price. We don't just drive to survive. We drive because it keeps them at bay, keeps the road from taking us. But it's a lie. They catch up eventually. No one can outrun them forever." I turned to look at him. His face was drawn, tired, as if he had been running for so long that he didn't know how to stop. His eyes were dark, haunted. "How long?" I asked, barely able to speak. "How long do we keep running?" The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, staring out into the night. For the first time, I saw something like fear in his eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him, demand that he tell me how to survive this. But before I could do anything, something caught my eye in the distance. A light. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a sign. It was something otherworldly. It shimmered, like the glow of a far-off city, but it wasn't right. It flickered like a dying flame. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. "There's a place up ahead," the stranger said, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. "It's not much, but it's something. Maybe it's the only way out." I stared at the light in the distance, my mind racing. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't care anymore. I was done running in the dark, done being chased by shadows. I had to know if this was the end, if this road had any chance of letting me go. "Get out," the stranger said, his voice hard, like he had made a decision. "Go. Now." I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door and stepped out, my legs trembling beneath me as I walked toward the flickering light. It wasn't far, just a few steps, but each step felt heavier, like the earth itself was trying to hold me back. The night air had turned cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made every breath feel like it was the last. I reached the light. It wasn't a city. It wasn't a building or a sign. It was a truck, old and rusted, sitting in the middle of the road, its headlights dim but still on, like someone had left it there for me to find. I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, like I had been here before, like I had always been here, and this was all just a part of the road's twisted game. I glanced back. The stranger was still standing by the truck, watching me, his eyes full of resignation. "Get in," he called, his voice softer now. "It's your turn." But I didn't understand. Couldn't. I turned back to the truck. The rusted door creaked open as if it had been waiting for me. I climbed inside, the seat cold beneath me, and there, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The man in the coat. But this time he wasn't alone. He was standing behind me, his face just visible in the reflection. "Where are you going?" he asked softly. "This road. It never ends." The engine started on its own, the truck rumbling to life, and the world around me seemed to shift, to blur, like the lines between reality and nightmare were fading. My body felt heavy, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The road stretched out ahead of me, endless, just like it always had. And I understood. I wasn't the one driving anymore. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.